The year was 1875, and the northern frontier of Michigan still bore the weight of untamed wilderness. Steamships plied the Great Lakes, trains thundered into new towns, and cities cried out for lumber to build homes, bridges, and factories. The land seemed endless, forests stretching to the horizon, towering pines standing like sentinels of another age. To the men who sought work, those forests were not merely trees, they were promises of wages, food, and survival in a world that was both expanding and unforgiving. It was in late spring when 121 men gathered at the small riverside settlement of Trask's Landing, a crude trading post where whiskey was cheap and the air always smelled of smoke and tar. They came from everywhere, farmhands fleeing debts, immigrants from Ireland and Germany, Civil War veterans with little else to live for, and boys too young to know what the wilderness demanded. Some were drifters, some seasoned lumberjacks, but all were bound by hunger and the need for work. A company out of Detroit, calling itself the Northern Timber Syndicate, had promised high wages to any man willing to clear a stretch of pine forest deep in the interior. The men were told it would be hard labor, yes, but safe enough. Just cut, haul, and stack. The recruiter, a barrel-chested man named Amos Fletcher, had stood on a crate and painted a picture of easy riches. The company would provide lodging, food, and protection. The forest would provide the rest. "You'll be carving your names into history," he had declared, his deep voice carrying over the din of the saloon. "The trees out there are as tall as church steeples, straight as rifle barrels, and worth their weight in gold. This is your chance to make something of yourselves." And so they signed, one after another, until the roster swelled to 121 names. By the end of May, they were ready to depart, each man carrying a bedroll, an axe, and whatever faith he still had in fortune. The journey into the forest was brutal, even before the real work began. They pushed inland by wagon and riverboat, then on foot, through terrain that seemed designed to break a man's will. The land grew darker the deeper they went. Towering pines that blotted out the sun, thickets of underbrush that tangled the legs, and marshes that swallowed boots whole. The air smelled of resin and damp earth, the calls of unseen birds echoing like warnings. At night, the men huddled by campfires listening to wolves howl in the distance, while Fletcher reassured them that they were close to their destination. By the 5th day, blistered and weary, they reached the clearing where the syndicate had ordered them to build their camp. It was an open patch of ground ringed by enormous trees, the trunks wider than wagon wheels, their crowns lost somewhere in the mist. The place felt ancient, untouched, as though no human foot had ever pressed its soil. Some men muttered that it felt wrong, too quiet, too heavy with shadows, but others laughed off the unease, grateful simply to rest. The work began at once. Axes rang against wood, the crash of falling trees shook the earth, and sweat soaked through rough wool shirts. Within a week, the skeleton of the camp took shape. Long bunkhouses fashioned from raw logs, a cookhouse with a stone hearth, and a tool shed stacked with saws and wedges. The men were given their tasks and thrown into a routine of labor that left them too exhausted to complain. Yet even in those first days, unease simmered beneath the surface. The forest seemed to press against them, watching, waiting. At night, the wind threaded through the pines with a voice like whispering. Shadows moved oddly, stretching in ways that did not follow the firelight. One man swore he heard laughter in the trees, though none of his fellows admitted to it. Another claimed he found footprints too large to be human pressed deep into the mud near the riverbank. Fletcher dismissed it all as superstition. "This is a wild land," he told them. "It plays tricks on weak minds. You'll hear and see plenty if you let fear get the better of you." But the men could not shake the feeling that they had crossed into a place they were never meant to disturb. Each tree felled seemed to echo like a scream through the woods. Birds fled before the chopping began, and once a herd of deer bolted through camp as if fleeing from something far worse than men with axes. The cook, a gray-bearded fellow named Harlan Pike, began leaving small offerings of bread and salt at the edge of the clearing, muttering prayers from his grandmother's old country. Most mocked him, but a few secretly thanked him, afraid not to. Still, spirits were high enough in the beginning. Pay was promised, meals were hearty, and the men clung to the notion that they were part of something grand. They joked over cards by lantern light, sang old work songs, and dreamed of the wages they'd carry home when the job was done. No one yet imagined how quickly the laughter would sour, or how soon the number 121 would begin to dwindle. On the 12th night after their arrival, the first scream cut through the camp. It came from the tree line, sharp, sudden, and silenced almost at once. The men rushed from their bunks, clutching axes and lanterns, but found only darkness pressing between the trunks. Fletcher barked orders, sent a search party, and after an hour of fruitless searching, they returned empty-handed. One man was missing, Elias Hodge, a 20-year-old from Ohio who had joined the crew to escape his father's farm. His bedroll was still laid out, his boots by the bunk, as though he had never intended to leave. The camp grew silent that night, fear creeping into every corner. No one spoke of curses or spirits, but the word lost carried a weight heavier than any axe. Lost in that forest might mean drowned in a bog, mauled by wolves, or something worse, something no one wished to name. By morning, work resumed as if nothing had happened. Yet every man felt the change, the shift in the air, as if the forest had claimed its first toll, and it would not be the last. Morning after Elias Hodge's disappearance was gray and wet, the sky low with mist that clung to the treetops like smoke. The men stirred uneasily, but Fletcher forced them back to work. He barked orders with a sharpness that left no room for hesitation. "A man gets lost in these woods, that's all." "Happens more than you think. The best thing we can do is keep busy. Idle hands invite madness." The men obeyed, though their glances kept straying toward the tree line, each shadow now looking like a doorway to some unseen abyss. The sound of axes and saws returned, echoing through the clearing. Pine after pine toppled, their trunks dragged to the riverbank where they'd later be floated downstream. The syndicate had ambitious plans. The camp was to become a base of operations, cutting deeper into the forest season after season, feeding an insatiable demand for lumber in cities far away. Fletcher oversaw the labor with tireless resolve, but in the eyes of the men, something had shifted. They no longer believed they were merely workers. They were intruders in a place that had never been meant for them. The camp itself grew quickly. Long barracks of rough-hewn logs lined the clearing, their roofs thatched with pine boughs. The cookhouse smoked day and night, filling the air with the smell of boiled beans, salt pork, and bread baked in iron pans. Men collapsed into bunks at dusk, their muscles aching from the relentless work. Yet rest never came easily. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by strange noises, the snapping of branches, faint cries carried on the wind, and sometimes the muffled tread of footsteps outside the walls. One evening, a man named Corbett returned from felling trees with a wild look in his eyes. He swore he had seen a figure in the forest, tall and pale, standing perfectly still among the pines. He dropped his axe when he noticed it, and when he bent to retrieve it, the figure was gone. The men laughed nervously, but not all of them. The cook Pike spat into the fire and muttered that the forest spirits didn't take kindly to strangers. Fletcher silenced him with a glare, insisting that Corbett had likely seen a deer, or perhaps another worker wandering too far from his post. But the tale spread, and by lantern light men whispered of ghosts and watchers that lived in the green-black dark. By midsummer the toll of the forest grew harsher. A log slipped from a sled and crushed a man's leg beyond repair. Another drowned when the current pulled him under while guiding rafts downstream. The accidents were bloody but believable, tragedies of dangerous work. Yet disappearances became harder to explain. 2 men went missing within a week, both vanishing without a trace. Their tools and bedrolls were left behind, their names struck silently from the tally. Fletcher refused to let the men dwell on it. "The forest eats the careless," he told them. "That's why you stay sharp. Anyone who wanders off might as well dig his own grave." Still, fear festered. Some men began carving marks into the trunks of trees, strange protective symbols learned from old countries. Others left food at the edge of camp beside Pike's offerings, no longer mocking the cook's superstitions but clinging to them. Whispers circled that the syndicate had chosen this site for reasons beyond timber, that the company had been warned by trappers never to cut this forest, and that Fletcher was paid handsomely to ignore such warnings. The forest itself seemed to resist them. Trees fell with more difficulty, as if their roots clung stubbornly to the soil. Tools broke more often, iron teeth snapping from saws, axe handles splitting without cause. Men claimed to hear knocking sounds from inside the trees before they fell, like fists pounding from within. One lumberjack swore he heard voices whispering his name as he swung his axe, and he fled the site in terror, never to be seen again. Fletcher called it cowardice. The others called it survival. At night, the campfires no longer felt warm. Men huddled close, but the darkness beyond seemed thicker, alive. One evening, a horse tethered near the stables went mad, thrashing until it snapped its own neck. Another night, the cookhouse door was found ripped from its hinges, though no storm had passed and no footprints marked the ground. Each event deepened the sense that the forest was closing in, testing them, waiting for weakness. By August, their numbers had already dropped below 100. Some had vanished, others had fled outright, walking away into the endless woods despite Fletcher's warnings that no man could survive alone. The rest labored on, their eyes hollow, their laughter gone. When they looked at each other, they no longer saw comrades. They saw potential corpses, the next to disappear, the next to be swallowed by the shadows. Fletcher remained a tower of iron resolve, or at least he appeared so. In truth, he had begun drinking heavily at night, pacing the camp like a restless hound. He knew he was losing control, but he clung to the mission, to the wages promised, to the syndicate's demands. Abandoning the camp would mean failure, ruin, perhaps worse. So he pushed harder, driving the men to fell trees faster, to build more rafts, to ignore the whispers in the dark. But men are not machines, and fear corrodes faster than rust. Murmurs of mutiny began to circulate, led by a broad-shouldered Irishman named Donnelly, who said he'd had enough of Fletcher's lies. Donnelly claimed he'd seen the syndicate's ledgers, proof that other crews had vanished in the same forest before them. He said Fletcher knew it, that this place was cursed, and that their lives had been wagered for profit. Some listened, nodding grimly, while others begged him to keep silent, afraid of Fletcher's wrath. The camp that had once seemed a beacon of order now felt like a trap, a prison without walls. Each man wondered how long he could last, how many more would vanish before the forest claimed him too. The pines stood tall around them, unbroken, unyielding, and in their silence, the men began to feel less like loggers and more like prey. When September came, the air turned colder, sharper, the nights longer. The forest grew darker still, and with the autumn winds came voices that no one could dismiss as mere tricks. They drifted through the camp like chants, like laments, like laughter. Men woke in the night swearing that someone had been standing over their bunks, only to find nothing but shadows. A sickness spread among them, not of the body, but of the mind. And as the first snow threatened, the question was no longer whether they would finish the season's work. It was who, if any, would live long enough to leave the forest alive. By the time October set its grip upon the wilderness, the forest around the camp seemed more alive than the men themselves. The pines no longer stood like mere trees, but like watchmen, their shadows stretching into the camp even when no moon lit the sky. Nights grew colder, and the fires that once warmed the workers now seemed pitiful sparks against an endless dark. Men whispered that the forest was watching them, that it hungered, that each disappearance was a sacrifice demanded by something older than timber and soil. The voices began in earnest then, soft at first, like wind threading through branches. Some men swore they heard their own names carried on the night air, spoken in tones too familiar to dismiss. A few claimed to hear the voices of wives or mothers long gone, urging them to step into the woods. One man, Anderson, a Swede with a booming laugh that once filled the bunkhouse, followed such a voice into the trees one night. The others heard him calling back, at first playful, then frightened, then frantic. By dawn, only his torn cap was found snagged in a low branch, and the men knew they would never see him again. The bunkhouses grew restless. Sleep was a battlefield, haunted by nightmares that seemed stitched together from the forest's whispers. Men awoke drenched in sweat, insisting they had seen shapes looming over them, pale hands reaching from the rafters. Fletcher raged at them, called them weak, called them cowards, but even he no longer slept soundly. More often, he paced the camp with his rifle, muttering that wolves were near, though no tracks marked the ground. His temper grew short, and once he struck a man across the face for suggesting they abandon the camp before winter sealed them in. The cook, Harlan Pike, became a figure of strange reverence. Where once they mocked his superstitions, the men now clung to them. He hung charms of bone and twine over the doorways, burned herbs at night, and muttered prayers in a tongue none understood. The syndicate might have scoffed at such rituals, but here, deep in the wilderness, the men felt they needed any shield they could find. Pike warned them never to answer the voices in the trees, never to speak their own names after dusk, and never to look too long into the dark between the pines. Still, fear ate away at them. The work slowed to a crawl, each swing of the axe burdened not just by exhaustion but by dread. They cut fewer trees, dragged fewer logs, and Fletcher's fury grew until his booming shouts rang across the clearing like cannon fire. Yet even he could not deny what was happening. His own brother-in-law, a tough soldier who had fought at Shiloh, vanished during a midday task. One moment he was guiding a log down the riverbank. The next, he was gone, as though the forest had swallowed him whole. The men found his axe half buried in mud, but no footprints, no struggle, no sound. Desperation sank its claws deeper with every passing night. Some turned to drink, emptying what whiskey remained in Pike's stores. Others grew violent, lashing out at each other over cards, over scraps of food, over the smallest slight. Donnelly, the Irishman who had spoken of mutiny, began gathering men around him by the fire, whispering that Fletcher was leading them all to death, that the syndicate had sent them here as fodder. He argued that the forest wanted something, and that unless they offered it, none of them would ever leave alive. What that something might be, he would not say, but his eyes glittered when he looked toward Fletcher. One night, the whispers in the forest swelled into a chorus. Men swore the trees themselves groaned like voices, their branches bending though no wind stirred. The sound rose and fell like chanting, pulling at the ears, gnawing at the mind. A young logger named Keats shoved rags into his ears and begged the others to do the same. Still, 3 men wandered into the woods that night, their faces slack as if sleepwalking. They did not return. The clearing grew smaller by the day, not because the forest closed in, but because the men dared not stray far from the firelight. Where once they had cut deep paths, they now kept close, their axes biting only at the edges. The syndicate's dreams of vast rafts of timber were forgotten. Survival was all that remained. Even Fletcher began to falter. His booming voice turned hoarse, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He muttered of strange dreams, dreams of black rivers running through endless trees, dreams of figures without faces watching him from the shadows. By late October, their number had fallen below 70. Some had been claimed by accidents, more by vanishings, and a handful by desertion. Of those who fled, none were seen again. The camp became a hollow echo of what it once was. Laughter was gone, songs were silenced. Men sat in silence by the fire, staring into flames as if afraid of what they might see if they turned their gaze outward. The forest loomed around them, patient, unyielding, waiting. Then came the night when the bunkhouse itself betrayed them. The men had just settled in when a pounding began on the outer walls, slow, deliberate, like fists the size of hammers. Lanterns shook as the logs creaked under the assault. Some men screamed, others prayed, and Fletcher shouted for them to hold steady. He fired his rifle through the wall, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The pounding stopped. When they rushed outside, the forest stood in silence, the moonlight silvering the pines. No footprints marked the earth. No animal could have struck the walls with such force. And though they searched, they found nothing. Nothing but silence. That night, more than one man confessed he wished the snow would fall heavy enough to trap them, to bury them in cold white silence, if only to keep whatever haunted the trees at bay. But no snow came, only darkness, only whispers, and the slow unraveling of the men who remained. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a presence, and it was hungry. By November, the men had begun to keep count, not in the company's ledgers, not in Fletcher's reports, but in whispered tallies scratched into the bunkhouse walls. Names became numbers, numbers became scratches, scratches became silence. 121 had entered the forest. Fewer than 60 remained. And though each loss cut deep, one name carried heavier weight than the rest. Elias Hodge, the farm boy from Ohio, the first to vanish into the trees. His disappearance had been spoken of less and less as others followed, but the men never forgot. It was Elias who had set the pattern, Elias who had stepped into the darkness and never returned. Some swore they still heard his voice at night, thin and broken, calling from deep within the woods. Others claimed they saw his face between the trees, pale and watchful, though no body was ever found. For many, Elias had become a symbol, not just of death, but of the forest's hunger. The whispers grew louder as winter closed its grip. They came not just at night, but during the day, threading through the groan of trees, curling around the clash of axes. Men stumbled mid-swing, swearing they had heard Elias calling their names. One logger, Sanderson, refused to work altogether, insisting that Elias was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. When pressed, Sanderson pointed to the tree line, trembling, eyes wide. Fletcher found nothing there but shadows, and in a fit of rage, struck Sanderson to the ground. By morning, Sanderson too was gone. The men began to believe the forest did not merely take them at random. It chose, it lured. It called out in voices familiar, dragged them away, and left nothing behind. The cook, Pike, muttered of old tales his grandmother had told him, that spirits of the woods took men in exchange for balance, that once disturbed, the land demanded offerings. Fletcher called it nonsense, but his voice was hollow now, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling even when wrapped around a bottle. The weather turned bitter, and snow finally began to fall in ragged sheets. The campfires struggled against the icy wind, and the bunkhouses reeked of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Food grew scarce despite Pike's efforts. Rats gnawed through sacks of flour, and barrels of salted pork spoiled quicker than they should have. Hunger joined fear as another specter at their tables. Then one night a group of men swore they saw Elias again. It was just before dawn, the camp wrapped in a thick fog. A shape emerged at the tree line, thin, staggering, dressed in the same patched coat Elias had worn months before. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant. He said nothing, only lifted a hand as if beckoning. Half the men froze, unsure whether to run or approach. Donnelly, the Irishman, spat on the ground and shouted for the figure to speak. It did not. Instead, it turned, stepped back into the fog, and was gone. Panic spread. Some insisted Elias was alive, trying to return, and they should search for him. Others said it was no man at all, but something wearing his skin, baiting them deeper into the forest. Fletcher forbade any search party, but he had to post guards that night to stop the men from going after the apparition on their own. The guards did not last long. 2 nights later, both disappeared without a sound. Their rifles lay where they had been stationed, barrels still warm from the fire. Whispers of mutiny rose again. Donnelly gathered men around him and spoke openly now of abandoning the camp. "The syndicate sent us to die," he growled, his thick accent sharpening every word. Fletcher knew it. He's known from the start. Every man who vanishes feeds this cursed place, and if we stay, none of us will leave. His words carried weight. Fletcher struck him once for speaking out, but fewer and fewer men came to Fletcher's defense. As the nights grew longer, the men began to fear not just the forest, but each other. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, fear gnawed at their minds, and suspicion hollowed their trust. When a man disappeared, accusations flew. Had he run? Had someone killed him in the dark? Fletcher tried to maintain order, but the camp was slipping from his grasp. Then came the night of the bonfire. Donnelly and his followers built it high in the clearing, a roaring tower of flame meant to drive back the shadows. They gathered around it, shouting curses into the trees, daring the forest to show its face. Some wept as they hurled offerings into the fire, scraps of food, talismans, even tools. They cried Elias's name, demanded his return, demanded the forest release what it had taken. The forest answered. It began as a low moan, rolling through the pines like the sound of 100 voices speaking at once. The ground trembled, branches shivered though no wind stirred. Then from the tree line dozens of pale shapes emerged. Some swore they were animals, twisted and broken. Others swore they were men, men they knew, men who had vanished. Elias among them. Their faces were slack, their movements unnatural, their eyes black hollows. They did not charge, did not attack, only watched from the edge of firelight, silent and waiting. The men screamed, some dropping to their knees in prayer, others reaching for rifles. Fletcher shouted for them to hold steady, but the order fell on deaf ears. Shots rang out, sparks flying into the night, but the shapes did not fall. They simply faded back into the trees, swallowed by the dark. When dawn came, the forest was still, silent. But the men knew what they had seen. The first to vanish had returned, but not as a man. From that night onward, Hope bled out of the camp like water through a cracked barrel. Men no longer counted days, only bodies. The tally on the wall grew shorter, and each time Fletcher marked another disappearance, his hand shook harder. They all knew now Elias had been only the beginning, and the forest was far from finished. By December, snow lay heavy on the camp, muting every step, every voice. The once constant sound of axes and saws had gone silent. No one worked the timber anymore. The clearing that had once echoed with labor now stood frozen, a graveyard of half-felled trees and abandoned sleds. The men huddled in the bunkhouses, their bodies starved, their minds unraveling. The forest had won. The syndicate's grand logging dream was nothing but a tomb for the living. Food had dwindled to nearly nothing. Pike scraped the bottom of flour barrels, stretched beans with melted snow, and handed out portions so small that fists clenched around them in fury. The salted pork had long spoiled. The bread had turned to mold. Hunger was no longer a whisper in their bellies, but a gnawing beast that left them weak and delirious. Men began eyeing one another not as comrades, but as meat. Fletcher tried to stamp out such talk, but whispers of cannibalism slithered through the bunkhouse like rats in the dark. Madness did not strike all at once. It seeped in, drop by drop, until every man bore its stain. Some muttered to themselves, carrying on conversations with invisible companions. Others rocked silently, eyes glassy, as though the forest's whispers had lodged permanently inside their skulls. A logger named Graves refused to leave his bunk, convinced that if he moved, the shadows would drag him into the trees. Another, young Keats, carved strange symbols into the floor with his knife, claiming they would protect him from the forest watchers. The more he carved, the more frantic he became, until Fletcher had to wrest the blade from his hands. Donnelly grew louder as Fletcher grew weaker. The Irishman rallied those who had lost all faith in leadership, declaring that Fletcher was the cause of their suffering. He knew this place was cursed. Donnelly snarled by the fire one night, his breath steaming in the cold. He dragged us here for coin, and now we're dying one by one while he drinks himself blind. If we want to live, we take control. We leave him for the forest. The men murmured agreement, though none dared yet raise a hand against Fletcher. But Fletcher was not blind to the shift. He saw the way men avoided his eyes, the way they gathered around Donnelly like moths to flame. He clung to his authority with what little strength remained, pacing the camp with his rifle, barking orders that no one followed. He was a captain without a crew, a general whose army had deserted him. The more he tried to hold on, the faster the camp slipped through his fingers. The night it broke began like any other, snow falling softly, fire sputtering in the cookhouse hearth, silence pressing heavy around them. But in the bunkhouse, Donnelly stood and called for action. His voice was thunder in the stillness. "No more waiting," he declared. "No more starving, no more dying. We leave tonight. Those who follow Fletcher will follow him to the grave. The rest of us, we take what's left and we get out." Shouts erupted, fists pounded tables, and men surged to their feet. Fletcher stormed in, rifle in hand, and demanded silence. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt, his beard unkempt. "Sit down!" he roared. "You'll doom us all if you try to leave now. The forest will eat you alive before you've gone a mile." But Donnelly stepped forward, towering over him, and spat in his face. "The forest already has us," he growled. "Better to die running than rot in this camp under your lies." The fight was brutal, raw, and short. Fletcher struck first, swinging the butt of his rifle into Donnelly's jaw. Donnelly fell but rose again like a bull, fists flying. The bunkhouse erupted into chaos, men shouting, grappling, spilling into the snow outside. Some tried to break the fight, others cheered it on. Fletcher and Donnelly crashed into the snow, fists and boots landing blows that echoed in the night. Then, in a flash, Fletcher raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang like thunder through the clearing. Donnelly collapsed, blood blooming dark against the snow. Silence fell heavy over the camp, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Fletcher stood over the body, chest heaving, eyes blazing. "Anyone else?" he snarled. No one spoke. But the silence was not surrender. It was hate, festering and sharp. From that night, the camp was split beyond repair. Those loyal to Fletcher dwindled to a handful. The rest, though leaderless without Donnelly, seethed with rage and whispered of vengeance. Fletcher slept with his rifle at his side, drinking himself into stupors, knowing the men might slit his throat before the forest ever claimed him. And still the whispers continued. Louder now, closer. Men woke screaming, swearing hands had reached for them in the night. Shadows moved at the edges of firelight, sometimes shaped like the missing, sometimes like beasts no man could name. A frostbitten logger claimed he saw Elias again, standing at the bunkhouse door, smiling with teeth too sharp to be human. He clawed at his own eyes, trying to unsee it. The forest pressed tighter, its silence no longer empty but heavy, oppressive, crushing. It was not just taking men now. It was driving them into each other, turning their fear into knives. Hunger, madness, whispers, and blood. The forest needed no claws or fangs. It only needed time, and time was running out. The winter of 1875 closed in like a coffin lid. Snow buried the camp so deep the roofs of the bunkhouses sagged beneath its weight, and the paths between them became narrow trenches of ice. Smoke from the cookhouse rose weakly, carrying no scent of food. There was nothing left to cook but scraps of boiled leather and bitter pine tea. The men who remained were shadows of themselves, gaunt faces with hollow eyes, their clothes stiff with frost, their voices hoarse from cold and despair. Of the 121 who had entered the forest, fewer than 30 clung to life. The camp was no longer a community, but a battlefield. Fletcher, drunk and desperate, had lost all command. He patrolled with his rifle, muttering curses at the trees, at the men, at the syndicate that had abandoned them. The others avoided him, huddling in corners like hunted animals, whispering of escape. The name Donnelly was spoken like a curse, his death remembered as the moment the camp broke beyond repair. Some still claimed he was right, that Fletcher had known the truth, that the syndicate had sent them into a cursed forest on purpose. Whether true or not, it no longer mattered. Survival, not truth, was the only currency left. Then came the storm. It began with a low howl of wind through the pines, rising to a scream as snow lashed the camp. For 3 days it raged, burying sleds, collapsing walls, driving men to huddle together for warmth. In that darkness something moved. Shapes pressed against the bunkhouse walls, scraping like claws across the logs. Men swore they saw faces peering through cracks, pale and hollow-eyed, mouths moving though no sound came. Some said it was Elias again. Others swore they saw Donnelly, his jaw still bloodied where Fletcher had struck him down. No one dared open the doors. On the third night of the storm, Graves, the man who had refused to leave his bunk, began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then rose into a wild cackle that sent shivers through the room. He stood, eyes shining with madness, and pointed to the door. "They're waiting for us!" he cried. "They've been waiting all along. Don't you hear them calling?" Before anyone could stop him, he tore the door open and vanished into the blizzard. His laughter echoed for only a few seconds before it was swallowed by the storm. By dawn, the storm broke. What it left behind was silence, too deep, too heavy. The men ventured out and found no tracks where Graves had gone, only smooth snow. That was when Pike, the cook, gathered what strength he had and said aloud what all were thinking. "If we stay, none of us will see spring. The forest wants us dead. The only chance left is to leave now, tonight, before it takes us all." His voice, frail but resolute, cut through the despair. Heads lifted, eyes flickered with something close to hope. Fletcher opposed it, of course. He raged that leaving was suicide, that the syndicate would come, that reinforcements would arrive when the thaw began. But his words fell flat. The men no longer saw a leader in him, only a broken drunk clinging to lies. That night a decision was made. They would attempt the impossible, a march through the frozen wilderness, back toward Trask's Landing, back toward life. The preparations were pitiful. They had little food, no sled dogs, only what meager tools and weapons they could carry. Pike divided the scraps of beans and flour into small sacks, enough for perhaps 3 days. They bound rags around their boots for warmth, wrapped themselves in blankets, and prayed the forest would not notice their flight. When night fell, the survivors slipped from the camp. They moved like ghosts through the snow, breath steaming, hearts pounding. Fletcher tried to stop them, staggering from his cabin with rifle in hand, shouting curses. But no one listened. He fired a shot into the air, his voice breaking as he screamed, "The forest won't let you go!" His warning was drowned by the crunch of boots as the men pressed on, leaving him behind. Some claimed later they heard him still shouting long after the camp had vanished from sight. Others swore they heard something else answering him. The march was brutal. The snow was waist-deep in places. the cold biting through every layer of cloth. Men stumbled, fell, and were dragged to their feet by others. The forest was silent, but never still. Shadows shifted between trees, whispers curled through the wind. More than once someone claimed to see Elias leading them, just out of reach, beckoning them deeper into the dark. Others said they heard Donnelly's voice urging them to turn back. The first night on the march, 3 men vanished from their bedrolls. No one saw them leave. No tracks marked the snow. By morning, only their impressions remained, shallow dents in the frost where their bodies had lain. The survivors pressed on, tighter now, huddling together as if numbers could keep the forest at bay. The second night, wolves appeared. At least that's what some claimed they were. Eyes gleamed from the tree line, low growls rumbling. But when shots were fired, the eyes did not scatter. They blinked out all at once, as if never there. The men slept little that night, gripping rifles and axes, waiting for a charge that never came. By the third day, their numbers had dwindled further. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, hunger hollowed faces, exhaustion bent backs. Some collapsed and could not rise. Others pressed on, too afraid to linger. The forest seemed endless, the trees repeating, the path circling back upon itself. More than one man swore they passed the same broken pine 3 times. Pike insisted they were moving forward, but even his faith began to crack. At last, on the 5th day, the trees began to thin. The survivors stumbled into a clearing where the frozen river stretched wide, a silver path leading away from the forest's heart. They wept, fell to their knees, kissed the ice. Behind them the pines stood silent, black against the snow. None dared look too long, fearing what they might see watching from between the trunks. Only 9 men reached the river. Of the others, some had vanished in the night. Some collapsed in the snow. Some walked into the trees and never returned. 9 remained, ragged, starving, broken in body and mind, but alive. They followed the river south, half delirious, until at last they staggered into a fishing village weeks later. The villagers took them in, fed them, clothed them, listened with wide eyes as fragments of their tales spilled out. Most of what they said made no sense. Whispers in the dark, shapes in the snow, Elias calling from the trees. But one truth remained undeniable. 121 had entered the forest. Only 9 had walked out, and as the 9 were carried into safety, each turned back at least once, eyes searching the horizon. For though the forest lay far behind, they swore they could still hear it whispering their names. The 9 survivors never spoke of the forest in the same way twice. Each had seen something different, heard something different, suffered differently. Yet all carried the same hollow look in their eyes, as though part of them had been left behind among the pines. When the villagers nursed them back to health, they tried to explain what had happened. Words tumbled out in broken fragments, voices in the dark, shadows at the firelight's edge, vanished comrades who returned with faces that no longer belonged to men. Some swore it was hunger and frost that had driven them mad. Others said no man could dream such horrors. When word of their ordeal reached Detroit, the syndicate disowned them. Company officials insisted the men were liars, drunkards, deserters who had abandoned their contract. They pointed to Fletcher, still unaccounted for, as proof that the logging camp had simply collapsed under poor leadership. No mention was made of the dozens missing, no investigation ordered into the forest that had swallowed them whole. The syndicate quietly closed its books and turned its saws to other lands, but stories cannot be buried so easily. In taverns along the Great Lakes, rumors spread like wildfire. Men spoke of the forest of 1875 in hushed tones, telling of 121 who went in and only 9 who returned. Some embellished it with ghosts, others with demons, some with tales of native curses ignored by greedy companies. Superstition grew. By the following spring, few loggers dared venture near that part of the wilderness. Trappers swore they heard cries at night, and hunters claimed to see pale figures moving among the trees. The forest gained a name, the Dead Man's Pines. The 9 survivors scattered across the country, none returning to logging. Some found work as dock hands, some as farm laborers. One even joined the railroads pushing west. But no matter how far they went, the forest followed them. Nightmares plagued their sleep, dreams of Elias calling from the trees, of Donnelly's blood on the snow, of shapes pressing against bunkhouse walls. A few drank themselves to death. One hanged himself in a barn, leaving behind only the words, "It's still calling." Pike, the cook, lived longest. In his old age, he told the tale often, though no one ever knew how much was truth and how much was the ramblings of a man haunted beyond reason. He insisted that the forest had not merely taken their comrades, but changed them, hollowed them, made them part of something older and darker than men could understand. It wasn't wolves, he would say, eyes distant. It wasn't hunger. It was the forest itself. It wanted us. It still wants us. Children listened wide-eyed, but their parents shushed them, whispering that Pike was mad. Yet even those who laughed never dared set foot near the dead man's pines. In the decades that followed, the clearing where the camp once stood was swallowed again by the trees. Bunkhouses rotted, logs crumbled, fire pits filled with moss. Travelers who wandered too close sometimes spoke of hearing axes in the distance, though no camps remained. A hunter once claimed he found a wall of a bunkhouse still standing, with scratches carved deep into the wood, tally marks that ended at 121. He said the air around it was heavy, suffocating, and that he left at once, never to return. By the turn of the century, the story had passed into legend. Newspapers occasionally revisited it in Halloween editions, titling it The Cursed Logging Camp or The Lost Men of 75. Skeptics argued it was a tale born of starvation and madness, nothing more than the tragic failure of a reckless company. Believers whispered otherwise, that the 9 who returned had escaped only because the forest had allowed them to, as warnings to others. That the dead man's pines were not meant to be disturbed. Even in modern times, long after the timber companies abandoned the region, hikers and explorers who ventured too deep into those woods reported strange experiences. Some claimed compasses spun uselessly, others swore they heard their names carried on the wind. A few returned, speaking of figures glimpsed in the mist, gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes. None stayed long. The forest remains untouched, vast and silent, a green-black sea that seems to breathe with secrets. The tale of the 121 men lives on not in company records or history books, but in whispers, in fireside retellings, in the nervous glances of those who know better than to wander too far. It is a story of greed, of hunger, of madness, but above all, of a forest that does not forgive trespass, and so the legacy endures. In 1875, 121 men entered the forest. Only 9 walked out. The rest are still there. Somewhere, between the pines, in the silence that waits when the wind dies, you can almost hear them. The chop of axes, the crack of trees, the voices of men long gone, still whispering, still working, still trapped. The forest never gives back what it takes. It only waits.